Welcome to our second lesson from our second unit on political participation. This is topic 2.2, political polarization. Our goal today is for you to be able to identify the causes, dangers, and potential solutions to political polarization. Before I continue, I want to give credit where credit is due. This lesson is adopted primarily from an article from the Scientific American from October 29, 2020, titled Why Hatred and Othering of Political Foes Has Spiked to Extreme Levels. It was written by fantastic author Christy Ashwaubenon. Probably pronounced that wrong, but that's where the primary meat of this came from, and I'll make sure to link the article in the video itself in case you want to go and read it yourself. Our first key question is, what is political polarization? That is, how do we define this term? The first characteristic of political polarization is an increasing division between the political groups or political parties. So you see a widening division between Republicans and Democrats. They just don't agree on anything. As part of this widening gap between political groups, a second characteristic is that your political identity becomes closely tied to your personal identity. What this means is that being a Republican is at the very core of how you see yourself as a person, or being a Democrat is at the core of how you see yourself as a person. It becomes a key feature of how you define yourself. The next key characteristic is you see a shift from debating ideas to defending that group identity, because you're not defending an idea, you're defending what you're part of. Then you see this becoming moralized. That is, that not only are you part of a group that needs to be defended, but your group is morally right, and everyone who opposes your group, who is not a member of it, is morally wrong. That is, you are good and the other party is evil. The thing is, this is not always how it's been. Things were different in the past. For instance, political parties and ideologies, as we talked about in the previous lesson, are two different things. And in fact, in the past, Democrats had both liberal members and conservative members. And Republicans had liberals and conservatives inside their party as well. They were kind of mixed together. So being a liberal didn't mean being a Democrat, and being a conservative didn't mean being a Republican like it does today. Also today, identities strongly align with what party you're a member of. So racial groups, overwhelmingly African Americans, tend to vote for the Democratic Party. Evangelical Christians tend to vote overwhelmingly for the Republican Party. People in the South are more likely to vote for Republican. In the Northeast, more likely to vote for a Democrat. And so you see these identities being wrapped up, your race, your religion, your geography, being wrapped up in political parties so much so that Democrats no longer have conservatives. They're pretty much only liberals, and Republicans no longer have liberals, they're only conservatives. The end result of this is that your political affiliation, or the party that you see yourself as a member of, becomes part of what we call a mega identity. That people cling to this as a way to define who they are. So being a Democrat isn't just about being part of a political party, it's at the very core of your being, and this is what tends to drive polarization. Okay, so now we know what polarization is, let's talk about the effects it has on society. First and foremost, this polarization is actually tearing families and communities apart. You have people who identify as Democrat or Republican within the same family, and they won't even talk to each other anymore. You have people within a neighborhood who refuse to talk neighbor to neighbor because of the political party they identify. So there's this refusal to even be in the same space as someone who's from a different political party. And since you're no longer talking to people who have different ideas from a different political party, this creates the exaggeration of what the other side believes. And it makes it harder for politicians then to compromise on laws, because we start to see the other side is so drastically different from us that if our politicians from our party compromise with politicians from that other party, it must mean our politicians are betraying us and are no longer part of our group. You can see the damaging effect this would have on the ability to pass any laws that are, makes everyone at least a little happy. And because of this exaggeration, policy debates are replaced with what we call tribal conflict. We start to see politics as a zero-sum game, where if the other side gets anything, that means it's at our expense. So we have to do everything we can to make sure the other political party doesn't get any policies passed that they like, because that means that it hurts our side. Winning for us becomes more important than actually doing what's best for society as a whole. The end result is what we call erosion of common ground. That is, the things that both sides agree on becomes smaller and smaller and smaller, and we stop living in the same reality as facts become dismissed if they don't match your ideology. So if the fact 2 plus 2 equaling 4 hurts your political ideology's plan of what you want to do, then you just, instead of changing your ideas to fit the facts, you just dismiss the fact as not being real because it's just something the other side made up and you don't agree with it. It doesn't exist. It's just an opinion anyways. So there is no common facts anymore. Now let's talk about why this is so dangerous, because this creates a cycle of hatred and distrust. People become more and more willing to use violence against people from opposing ideologies because of this intense polarization and this idea that if the other side wins, my side loses. A natural consequence of this is that what we call democratic norms, those things that keep our democracy functioning because we all kind of agree to do them, those start to fall apart as winning becomes more important than governing the country. This also reduces our willingness to compromise, whether it's politicians compromising with other politicians or you compromising with your neighbor who has a different political ideology. And eventually, this leads to both political parties promoting and running candidates that are more extreme in their ideologies, as each party tries to find candidates that best matches what they would call the purest form of the ideology of their members. All of this opens us up to foreign manipulation of countries like Russia, China, Iran, who we have the evidence that shows they've been using this polarization to manipulate us, to turn us against each other. What's the end goal of this? Well, the ultimate goal would be for the United States to tear itself apart into a civil war, but they're more than happy just to have us fight each other and be distracted with arguing amongst ourselves and fighting ourselves while they can go about achieving their goals. So, for instance, Russia invading Ukraine. One of the only things keeping Ukraine from falling to Russia right now is the U.S. support. But if they can make that a polarized issue, then the U.S. can drop out of supporting Ukraine, and Russia can take over that territory. China's got a similar strategy when it comes to Taiwan. As long as we're busy fighting ourselves and tearing ourselves apart, the U.S. isn't getting involved in the world stage and promoting our democratic values and the things that we hold dear to ourselves, like natural rights. Okay, so we talked about what polarization is. We've talked about why it's so bad. Let's talk about how it happens. The first step in extreme polarization is the othering of people from the different political ideology. That is, portraying them or showing someone from the other ideology as different, as alien, as something you can't relate to. Once you start seeing people from the other political ideology as so different from you that you can't even understand them, you start to do the second step, which is aversion. That is, you see them as so unlikable that you don't want to be around them at all. This has actually resulted in people not just moving from one neighborhood to another, but moving from one state to an entirely different state in order to be with other people who share with their political ideologies. And then finally, there is moralization. That is, believing that the other side isn't just different and unlikable, but they're actually evil and corrupt, and anything they do is actually morally wrong. If you're religious, a sin. It is the worst thing possible to think the way the other side thinks. The media and social media in particular play a really big role in this. Now, we're going to be doing an entire lesson on how the media, that is, how the 24-hour news cycle has actually led to this extreme polarization. But what I want to focus on here is the social media algorithms, which are designed to amplify division and anger. Social media companies really want you to spend as much time on their websites as possible. So Facebook, TikTok, Twitter, they want as much engagement as possible to keep your eyes on that screen as long as possible. And what they found is things that make people angry tend to make them interact with their website more. And so in order to get them interacting more, they show us more of what angers us. So as a result, they show us things that support the things we already believe to be true, that further angers us about the other side, and pushes us to extremes through suggesting other similar content creators or websites that only further push us to the extremes of our ideologies. And this is done all in the name of keeping us on these social media sites longer so that they can sell more ads to make more money. And as these algorithms divide us further and further into these different camps of ideologies where we're no longer seeing the same facts, the same stories, and even the stories we are being told are each being told to us that best supports what we already want to believe about that moment, we no longer have a shared worldview across society, and we start to live in our own realities where we couldn't possibly understand how someone could come to a different conclusion than you because everything you're seeing online is reinforcing what you already believe to be true. So anyone who sees things the other way, who have different beliefs than you about an event, well, they're clearly crazy at best or evil at worst. And the other side is thinking the exact same thing about you. So what are some things you should be looking out for to notice when people are becoming extremely polarized about politics? Well, you start to see political symbols as tribal markers, right? The flying of flags to promote your political party or the repeating of political slogans, right? Another thing you see a lot are bumper stickers like this, which are really super partisan and designed to get you angry about the other political party or the other ideology. Another thing to look out for is when politicians start to refuse to serve all their constituents. What I mean by this is if it is a Democrat holding a political office, if they're saying things or doing things that only helps the people who are Democrats in their area, that is a sign of extreme polarization. If you see a Republican doing this, where they're saying that they're only going to help people who live in Republican states or in Republican areas, that is another sign of extreme polarization. And finally, if you start to hear not just politicians, but other people using language that dehumanizes or describes political opponents as less than human or evil or not as worthy of something as people from your political ideology, that's another glaring sign that that person has become extremely polarized. Okay, so we've talked about what polarization is, we've talked about why it's bad, we talked about how it happens, how to identify when we see it happening to others. So the last question I want to address here is how do we stop polarization from spreading? The first step is to recognize when people are polarized, when they're using exaggerations about politics or ideologies. They use statements like all liberals or all conservatives, or statements like liberals just want to take the money from hardworking Americans and give it to all immigrants, or liberals only want to have open borders to allow anyone to come into the country and they want to get rid of all police departments. Or statements like all conservatives want to make sure that everyone's a Christian and they want to ban any other religion in the country. If people are making statements like this, you know they're polarized. So anything else they tell you, you have to take with a grain of salt and ask yourself, is what they're saying true, or is it being designed and said because they are trying to get you to agree with everything they say and become polarized yourself? The next thing we need to do is focus on the things that all Americans share in common, right? These are our shared values that whether you're a liberal or a conservative, Democrat or Republican, everyone pretty much agrees that natural rights are a thing that we as Americans believe in, that we are born free, that we have a right to our life, our liberty, and pursuit of happiness. We all agree that the government should not be all powerful and that the people should be in charge and that even members of the government should be held accountable when they commit crimes. So if we focus on these shared values, we can realize we actually all really do want the same thing. We also need to encourage respectful cross-party dialogue. What does that mean? That means take the time to respectfully talk to and get to know people with different points of view and backgrounds. This will really help you out when you're hearing people who are polarized using statements like all liberals or all conservatives, because then you'll have an experience in your life where you know, wait, I know this person, they're a liberal and they don't act like that, or I know this person, they're a conservative, they don't act like that. So by talking to people from other political parties, other ideologies, we can inoculate ourselves from polarization. And then we need to all take responsibility for rejecting hate-filled language. We ourselves should not be using loaded language that promotes hatred of different points of view. And then we should all be taking the time to really examine the people in our lives that we agree with, right? Whether it's a podcaster, someone on social media, on YouTube, TikTok, a family member, right? They agree with what you agree with. Well, take some time to examine their language. How do they describe those that don't support them? Do they use hate-filled language when describing someone from the opposite political ideology? Because if we shouldn't be using it, the people in our lives, we should let them know, hey, not all people from the other side are like this, right? We can bring down the temperature and stop this rhetoric so that polarization can start to reverse in this country. And yes, it may sound naive and simple, but having conversations with people who we disagree with and calling out hateful language and this othering language from people on our own side of the political aisle, that's going to go a long way to stopping this problem. Okay, as always, take a few minutes here at the end of the video, rewrite the goal from the top of the note sheet or the beginning of the video, write out full sentences, complete thoughts, 3 facts from these notes that help you understand that goal. And then, as always, I enjoy the questions I'm getting. I'm responding to all of them in your notes. What is at least one question you still have that could help you better meet this learning goal? We'll see you in class.